While I've made a lot of progress since the last video, the thing I want to focus on first is about the bugs that I have removed from the game. One of the longest standing difficulties I've had with this whole process is rotating something while holding an object in two hands. With one hand, it's really easy. You just pick up the object and essentially attach that object to the hand, so as you rotate your hand and move it around, the object moves with that hand. Problems arise though when you start holding an object with two hands in VR. In real life, when you're holding an object with two hands, those two hands are kind of connected to each other via that object, and there's limitations on where you can move them. In VR, because that object doesn't really exist, these same limitations don't exist. So you can freely move your hands around, even though they should be kept a fixed distance apart and at a certain rotation from each other. I've tried a few different strategies to help fix this disconnect between reality and the game, and up to now, nothing was working. My original method for solving this disconnect was to simply look at the original position your hands were in when you grabbed the object and compare them to the current position your hands were in. I could draw a vector from one hand to the other hand in both these positions to kind of give an original pointing vector of where the object was to a current pointing vector, assuming that to the best of the ability, the object should still be between your hands. Even if your hands are kind of switched to a illogical location, it should still try to put the object in the same orientation between your hands. While this method worked for small angles of movement of your hands, anytime you got close to about 180 degrees, the object would just start spinning. Initially, I thought this was some sort of small math error. Looking at what I was doing, I was computing the cross product between these two vectors from the initial position to the current position, and I noticed that if these two vectors were at close to 180 degrees from each other, it wouldn't be clear exactly how to perform that rotation, or rather a small hand rotation would result in a completely different rotation. However, more recently I realized that it's actually impossible, based purely on hand positions, to differentiate between rotating an object towards yourself in 180 degrees and rotating an object up and around itself 180 degrees. In both these cases, your hands end up in the same locations, but the object ends up rotated around the axis that your hands make, depending on the path taken. Simply looking at the beginning and ending positions, you can't tell which path was taken. That's why up to that point, until you get close to 180 degrees, it works perfectly fine. But as you get to 180 degrees, it can no longer tell which path was meant to be taken. My next method that I tried, and what has been shown in all the videos up to this point, is, well, if the initial and final positions isn't enough to tell you the path taken, why don't we do relative rotations? At each frame, the game would check how your hands have moved relative to the previous frame, and it would apply a rotation based on this small change. As a result, all the rotations would always be just a few degrees, and you'd never get a situation where you could rotate 180 degrees all at once. And for the most part, this seemed to work. It wasn't until I made a bow and arrow object that I started to notice that I seemed to have made a mistake somewhere. Depending on where you placed your initial hand on this two-handed object, sometimes the object would still spin regardless, and in fact spin a lot more wildly than it would using the other method. It was investigating this that I realized that there's an even bigger issue that can't be solved. While performing this relative rotation works pretty nicely when rotating around a single axis, once you start putting multiple rotations together, it's possible to rotate an object even though you never rotated it along that axis. Here you can see an object that's being rotated up to the left, back down towards me, and then back to the original position. Ideally, the object would still have the same rotation it started with, however, it has been rotated 9 degrees along the axis between my hands. What this means in practice is looking around with, say, a two-handed weapon will start rotating it in your hand. I didn't want this because I wanted, if your hands go back to the same position they started, I'd want the object to be in that same position. And after realizing this, I felt a little defeated. Everything seemed impossible, at least as far as I could tell. I decided to look a little bit closer at other VR games and see how they handled two-handed interactions. Hopping into the radius, I noticed that if you moved your hands in an illogical way, you would have the same spinning 180 degrees that I found with my first method. However, as long as you moved your hands in a somewhat logical way, rotating your primary hand as you're moving your secondary hand around, none of the rotations seem to break. It's almost like as long as your secondary hand went roughly to where it should be, based on the rotation of your primary hand, then nothing would break. It was only when you put your hands in a truly impossible way that the game would start to break and have a spinning object. Garbage input in, garbage results. It was after this that I realized there was another way to do two-handed rotations. First, ignore your secondary hand and simply rotate the object to wherever it would rotate if you're just holding it in one hand. And second, find where your secondary hand would be grabbing the object, and find where it currently is, and rotate the object so that those 2 points are as aligned as possible. What this means is as long as you're moving your hands in a fairly realistic way, it's only performing very small rotations, never anywhere close to 180 degrees. So it has the benefit from the second method, that is small rotations, and then it also has the benefit from the first method, that is being consistent. If your hands are in a particular position and you return to that position, the object should be in the same location. Having now implemented this method, I'm fairly certain this is how other VR games in general handle two-handed interactions. However, in a lot of games where there are standard pre-assigned locations that your hand can hold an object, it's a lot easier to work out where your hand would be versus where it currently is. With my game, because you can grab the object literally anywhere your hand collides with it, it was hard to work out where your hand was initially grabbing it and where that position would be now that the object has rotated and moved. After thinking about it for some time, I realized what I wanted to do was think about where my hand was in the XYZ world coordinates, but then translate over to the local XYZ of the object I was holding, sometimes called a basis. As soon as I realized that it was called a basis, I had this phrase in my mind, change of basis, playing over and over again, as if I'd learned it sometime in the past, this change of basis. Sure enough, I got out an old college textbook, and on one page there was something called a change of basis, and in a couple small paragraphs described exactly how to do it. And sure enough, this was exactly what I wanted. To put it simply, it would take the world coordinates of where my hand was when it grabbed the object, and put that into the local coordinates for the object I was grabbing. That way, when the object moves around and rotates and does all that, it's still in the same local coordinates where my hand would have grabbed. Then all I have to do is translate the current position of my hand into these local coordinates, and I can work out how far off my hand has moved and how far the object should be rotated. As I was going through this whole process, I didn't delete too much code as I was making these changes, because I was always like, well, maybe I need to go back. Maybe I almost had the idea earlier. I shouldn't delete it. So here is most of the code from my relative rotation, where I was applying small changes and updating my hand positions each frame. Up here you can see most of the code attempts at applying an absolute rotation. There's a whole lot of different ones. I would just kind of comment out one, try a new one, comment out one, try a new one, sometimes deleting it, but leaving a whole lot of failed attempts. And then here is the current code for rotating it. This first line of code is rotating the object to match up with wherever your primary hand is. Then it makes sure that you are holding something with two hands. And if you are, it does these simple 5 lines of code. In fact, the first 4 lines of these code are just setting up variables to make the 5th line look nice, but this could all be done in one line. As I was reading through my textbook about change of basis, I had this small feeling that maybe all this code I was trying out and writing was going to be way overkill, and that it was just going to be a couple functions to rotate one vector to another location. And yeah, it turns out I just have to multiply a couple bases by some vectors, and then apply a single rotation based on that. Alright, linear algebra, it's cool. What more can I say? Please learn it if you get a chance. Let's get to some more interesting things. Alright, first up, I made a bow and I made an arrow. This was a lot of work inside of Blender, making these, learning a lot along the way. The bow bends as your hands get further apart, and the arrow gets pulled back within the bow. I do have 2 separate objects, a bow and an arrow, and then I have a third object of a bow and arrow, the two objects combined into one. When you bring your two hands together, if one's holding a bow, one's holding an arrow, and you pull the trigger of your arrow hand as you get close to the string, they snap together and form a bow and arrow. Once you're holding the object, there are 3 ways to disconnect the bow and arrow. First, release your hand on the bow, it will drop to the ground, and your other hand will still be holding an arrow. Second, release the trigger on your arrow hand, and it will separate into a bow and arrow once again. Or, most interestingly, release your grip on an arrow and send it flying forwards, leaving you with a regular bow in your other hand. So not only are the bow and arrow made in Blender, but I also added an animation in Blender that then gets played as your hands get pulled further back. I'm pretty sure I took this idea from this video.
I made an animation in Blender for drawing the bow and rigged it in Godot with the incredible technique of setting the animation frame to a specific time based on a bunch of magic numbers and the distance between my hands. I'm pretty sure that's not how you're supposed to do it.
And as he says, the best way to do it is with an animation. So I made an animation with one small problem. Yeah, for some reason, the string just becomes a triangle. I don't know why this happens. In Blender, it doesn't look like this. If I open up the 3D file in some Windows viewer, it doesn't show this, but for some reason, in Godot, it makes a triangle. Honestly, at this point, I don't really care. Maybe it's because the string is too thin. I'm probably not going to fix it unless I update the bow model. It doesn't really bother me that much in-game. But now that we have a bow and arrow, we can fire them quickly into the distance or slowly close to us, and they can stick into different objects and walls. Though they don't always stick into the objects and walls. And I'm not sure if it's just because they're moving too fast or if there's something else. This is a bug I still need to fix. And speaking of bugs, if you shoot an arrow into an object and pick up the object, the arrows don't get added to your hand the same way everything else does. So I need to fix that. Alright, so I've actually removed the ability to shoot arrows into regular objects. I'm currently working on that. That's the thing I'm currently trying to fix, but I've made it more consistent about always sticking in objects that you can stick into to then climb on. Also, I've been working and I've added the ability to put away bows and arrows, and there's a set number. Once you fire enough arrows, or you could just throw them on the ground, that also works. You run out of arrows, likewise with a bow. Once you run out of bows, which is just one, you're out of them. But yes, anyway, continue with the video. But what does work is shooting an arrow into a wall means that you can then climb the arrows in that wall. This is a feature that I came up with a long time ago, and I'm so happy that I'm finally at a point that I can start implementing it. Speaking of bugs, there was one bug that I accidentally added and then swiftly solved. While looking through all my code, I was working with the pickups and climbing function, and I noticed after a whole bunch of if, else if, else if, else if statements, there was an else, and inside that there was hand grabbed position equals game hand object dot global transform. And I didn't really understand what this did exactly, but it sounded like something that I kind of wanted to always happen. The hand position would go to wherever the hand was, I was thinking. So I tried taking it out of the else statement, and initially nothing seemed to be broken, so I left it like that. Like a week later, I was trying to climb the quote-unquote rope that I made, and I started shooting off into space. It wasn't until a couple weeks later that I put 2 and 2 together, but for a long time I was like, why is this game just breaking? And then it turns out there was a reason I put this inside the else statement. I still don't fully understand what this line of code does, but it seems important. Maybe I'll come back and work it out at a later point. While not too much has changed since the last video, I pretty much just added a working bow and arrow. There was a lot going on in the background to make this happen. Tons and tons of scribbled notes about 3D rotations and vectors pointing in different directions, and a whole lot of struggle trying to work out what the heck animations in Blender do. But nonetheless, I think I am nearing the end of this project. I pretty much just want to fix a bunch of things and add a few more interactable things to be done with this bow and arrow. After that, I'll make a video on it, and then I will start a new project. This new project is a little bit more fleshed out in my mind as far as what it is as a game, less of just an experience for coding, and hopefully an end result I can release.